Imagine you are standing in what was, just months ago, one of the most powerful empires on earth. The streets are frozen. The bread lines stretch around corners that no longer have names anyone agrees on. The Tsar is gone. The government that replaced him is also gone. And now, in the winter of 1917, a small group of men who spent years writing pamphlets in European cafes are suddenly, improbably, in charge of 1/6 of the world's land surface. They have no real army yet, no stable currency, no functioning supply chain. Dozens of ethnic groups are declaring independence simultaneously. And the world's great powers are already sending soldiers to make sure this experiment fails. How does a country survive that? How does a revolution that nearly collapsed in its first week end up creating a state that lasts 70 years and reshapes the entire 20th century? And here is the question that should genuinely unsettle you. Was the Soviet Union born from a grand ideological vision, or was it born from desperation, improvisation, and the sheer refusal to lose power at any cost? If you find yourself drawn to history that actually explains how the world became what it is, consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these deep dives, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, honest history is worth sharing. Now, let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the revolution, the beginning of the collapse. Russia in the early 20th century was a paradox wrapped in ice. On paper, it was an empire of staggering scale, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing over 100 distinct ethnic groups and languages. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 300 years. The Orthodox Church gave the Tsar a divine mandate. The aristocracy controlled the land. And underneath all of that, something was cracking. The Industrial Revolution had come to Russia late and hard. Factories had sprung up in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, pulling millions of peasants off the land and into brutal urban conditions. These workers had no political representation, almost no labor protections, and wages that barely covered survival. Meanwhile, Russia's agricultural system was still feudal in many practical respects. Peasants had technically been emancipated from serfdom in 1861, but the land redistribution was deeply inadequate. Many families farmed tiny strips of earth while enormous estates sat nearby, managed by absentee landlords. Here is the first thing that surprises most people about this story. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was not the first revolution. In 1905, following a catastrophic military defeat by Japan and the massacre of peaceful protesters on what became known as Bloody Sunday, Russia had already shaken to its foundations. Tsar Nicholas II had been forced to grant a constitution and create a parliament, the Duma. But Nicholas never truly accepted these concessions. He repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it challenged him, rewrote the electoral rules to favor conservative landowners, and continued governing as though the divine right of kings was still a practical political reality in the 20th century. This matters enormously, because it means that by 1917, Russia had already been through one failed reform cycle. The moderate liberals and constitutional reformers had been given their chance and had been outmaneuvered by a Tsar who refused to share power. That failure would radicalize the generation that came next. And then came the war. World War I was catastrophic for Russia in ways that are difficult to fully convey. Russia mobilized millions of men, many of them peasants who had never left their villages, and sent them to fight a modern industrial war with rifles that sometimes ran out of ammunition and officers who had been promoted based on social class rather than military competence. By some estimates, Russia suffered over 3.5 million military dead, with total casualties, including wounded and prisoners, reaching numbers that historians still debate but agree were staggering, likely somewhere between 8 and 9 million. The logistical system collapsed. Trains that should have been carrying food to cities were commandeered for military supplies. By the winter of 1916 into 1917, the capital, Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed at the start of the war, was facing genuine bread shortages. In February of 1917, women textile workers went on strike. Within days, the strike had spread across the city. Soldiers sent to suppress the protests began refusing orders. Then they began joining the protesters. Within a week, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was over. Nicholas II abdicated on March 2, 1917, in a train car, handing power not to his son as originally planned, but to his brother, who refused it entirely. The world's largest autocracy had dissolved not in a dramatic final battle, but in a kind of exhausted shrug. What replaced it was a provisional government, drawn largely from liberal and moderate socialist members of the Duma. And here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because the provisional government made one decision that would prove fatal. They chose to continue the war. Their reasoning was not entirely irrational. Russia had treaty obligations. The war effort had created enormous debts to Britain and France, and many in the government believed that a military victory would strengthen Russia's new democratic institutions and give the revolution international legitimacy. But the soldiers and workers and peasants who had just overthrown the Tsar had not done so because they wanted to keep fighting. They had done it because they were exhausted, hungry, and done. The gap between the provisional government's agenda and the population's desperate needs was a canyon, and it would swallow the government whole. Running in parallel to the provisional government was another structure that almost no history textbook gives enough attention to: the Soviets. The word Soviet simply means council in Russian. These were elected bodies of workers, soldiers, and peasants that had sprung up spontaneously during the revolution, drawing on a tradition that went back to 1905. The Petrograd Soviet was the most powerful, but Soviets were forming in cities, in army units, in factories across the country. They had real popular legitimacy in a way the provisional government did not, and they were increasingly dominated by socialist parties, most prominently the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, with a smaller but intensely organized faction called the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin, who in April of 1917 arrived at Petrograd's Finland station in a sealed train car arranged by the German government. This is one of history's great ironies. Germany, hoping to knock Russia out of the war, facilitated the return of the man who would ultimately create a state that would outlast the German Empire by decades. Lenin stepped off that train and immediately did something that shocked even his own party. He announced that the Bolsheviks would not cooperate with the provisional government at all. No coalition, no compromise. He called for immediate peace, immediate redistribution of land to the peasants, and transfer of all power to the Soviets. His own colleagues thought he had gone too far. Within months, the slogan "peace, land, bread" would become the most powerful political message in Russia. But the Bolsheviks' path to power was not smooth. In July of 1917, a premature uprising in Petrograd, partly associated with Bolshevik agitation, was suppressed by the provisional government. Lenin fled to Finland. Trotsky was arrested. The Bolsheviks seemed finished. And then in August, a general named Lavr Kornilov attempted a coup against the provisional government itself, marching troops toward Petrograd. The government, led by Alexander Kerensky, had no reliable military force of its own. In desperation, he armed the Bolsheviks and the workers' militias, the Red Guards, to defend the capital. Kornilov's coup collapsed, his troops refusing to advance. But the consequences were permanent. The Bolsheviks had weapons now. They had military organization. And Kerensky had permanently destroyed his own credibility by first arresting the Bolsheviks and then arming them within the same summer. By October, the Bolsheviks controlled the Petrograd Soviet. Leon Trotsky, now free and leading the Soviet's military revolutionary committee, was the operational genius behind what came next. On the night of October 24th to 25th, 1917, Bolshevik forces and Red Guards seized key points across Petrograd: the telegraph offices, the railway stations, the bridges, the power stations. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government was meeting, was surrounded and eventually entered with minimal resistance. Kerensky had already fled the city, borrowing a car from the American embassy. The provisional government simply ceased to exist. Here is the second thing that surprises almost everyone. The October Revolution, as it became known, was not a mass popular uprising. It was a precisely organized seizure of infrastructure by a disciplined minority. Most of Petrograd's population slept through it. The city's restaurants stayed open. The Bolsheviks did not have majority support in the country. They had organizational superiority, timing, and an opponent who had exhausted its own legitimacy. But seizing power and holding it were entirely different problems. Lenin and the Bolsheviks immediately faced a crisis that would define the next 5 years. Russia was falling apart in every direction simultaneously. In November 1917, elections for a constituent assembly were held, elections that the Bolsheviks themselves had demanded. The socialist revolutionaries won the largest share of the vote. The Bolsheviks came second. When the assembly met in January 1918, the Bolsheviks dissolved it after a single day. This decision, dissolving the only democratically elected national body in Russian history at that point, was a watershed. It told every other political faction in the country that the Bolsheviks intended to rule alone. The consequences arrived quickly. Ukraine declared independence. Finland declared independence. The Baltic states began asserting autonomy. The Cossacks in the south were organizing resistance. And then came the most painful decision of the early Soviet government. In March of 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering enormous territories including Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of the Caucasus. Russia lost roughly a third of its European territory, a third of its population, and a huge portion of its industrial and agricultural base in a single treaty. Lenin pushed it through over furious internal opposition, arguing that the revolution needed peace to survive, even a humiliating peace. He called it an obscene peace, but a necessary one. The treaty saved the Bolshevik government in the short term, but it also triggered what became the Russian Civil War, one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. The Civil War was not a simple two-sided struggle. It was a chaos of overlapping conflicts. The White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and military officers opposed to Bolshevik rule, fought the Red Army that Trotsky was now building from scratch. But there were also the Greens, peasant armies that fought against both sides. There were nationalist movements across Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. There were foreign interventions, British, French, American, Japanese, and Czech forces, all operated on Russian soil at various points, supporting the Whites or pursuing their own strategic interests. There were anarchist forces under commanders like Nestor Makhno in Ukraine, who were allied with the Bolsheviks at some moments and fighting them at others. This is where the story reaches its most dramatic and consequential turning point. By 1919, the situation for the Bolsheviks looked genuinely desperate. White armies were advancing from multiple directions. Admiral Kolchak controlled Siberia. General Denikin's forces pushed north from the south and came within striking distance of Moscow. General Yudenich nearly reached Petrograd. The city of Petrograd, the cradle of the revolution, came close to falling. Food was catastrophically scarce. Industrial production had collapsed. The currency was almost worthless. Trotsky, according to accounts from the period, was moving between fronts on his famous armored train, personally stabilizing collapsing units, summarily executing deserters, and recruiting former Tsarist officers to command Red Army formations. That last detail is worth pausing on. The Red Army, the Army of the Workers' Revolution, was commanded in large part by officers from the old imperial military. Trotsky argued, against fierce internal opposition, that military expertise could not be improvised. He used former Tsarist officers, called military specialists, under the supervision of political commissars who had the authority to countermand orders and who were responsible for the officers' loyalty with their own lives. It was a brutal, pragmatic system, and it worked. Why did the Bolsheviks win the Civil War? Historians debate this seriously, and there is no single answer. Several factors worked in their favor. The Bolsheviks controlled the central regions of Russia, including the major cities and the railway network, which gave them interior lines of communication and the ability to shift forces between fronts. The White movement was geographically fragmented and politically incoherent, unable to agree on a common program or coordinate strategy. The Whites' association with foreign intervention damaged their legitimacy among Russian peasants, who might have opposed Bolshevik grain requisitioning but feared the return of the landlords even more. And the Bolsheviks offered a clear, if brutal, vision of the future, while the Whites offered mostly a return to something the population had already rejected. By 1920, the main White armies had been defeated. The Civil War was not entirely over. There would be further conflicts, including a war with Poland in 1920 that ended badly for the Bolsheviks and the suppression of various national movements, but the existential threat to Bolshevik power had passed. What emerged from those years of war and revolution was not the state Lenin had theorized in his writings. It was something stranger and more desperate. The policy known as war communism, implemented during the Civil War, had essentially nationalized everything, requisitioned grain from peasants by force, and abolished market exchange. It kept the Red Army fed and fighting, but it destroyed agricultural production. By 1921, famine had broken out across the Volga region and parts of Ukraine. Estimates of the death toll from this famine range widely, but most historians place it in the millions. Then, in March of 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, the very sailors who had been heroes of the October Revolution, rose in revolt against the Bolshevik government, demanding free Soviets, freedom of speech, and an end to grain requisitioning. Trotsky ordered the assault on the icebound fortress. The revolt was suppressed, but Lenin understood the message. Within weeks, he announced the new economic policy, a dramatic retreat from war communism. Peasants could now sell surplus grain on the market. Small private businesses were permitted. Foreign investment was cautiously invited. Lenin called it one step backward to take two steps forward. His critics within the party called it a betrayal of socialism. His defenders called it the move that saved the revolution from itself. What it undeniably did was allow the economy to begin recovering, and now the formal architecture of the new state had to be built. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially proclaimed on December 30th, 1922. The name itself was a deliberate ideological construction. It was not called Russia. It was not an empire. It was a union of republics, theoretically voluntary, theoretically equal, theoretically defined not by ethnicity but by class. The founding members were the Russian Soviet Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Republic, and the Transcaucasian Federation, which grouped together Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. More republics would join over time. The structure was a paradox that would haunt the Soviet Union until its final days. On paper, each republic had the right to secede. In practice, the Communist Party, which had no federal structure mirroring the states, was the real governing power, and it was centralized. The republics had cultural autonomy in some respects, even being encouraged to develop their own languages and national cultures in the early years, a policy called korenizatsiya or indigenization. But political power flowed from Moscow and from the party. Lenin himself was already ill when the USSR was formally proclaimed, having suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1922. He would die in January 1924, leaving behind a party that was already beginning to fracture over the question of succession. His final writings, including what became known as his testament, warned against giving too much power to any single leader and specifically criticized Joseph Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the party in 1922, for being too rude and concentrating too much personal power. The testament was suppressed after Lenin's death. Here is the third truly astonishing fact in this story. The man Lenin specifically warned his party against, the man he recommended removing from his position, would go on to rule the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades and reshape it so fundamentally that the state Lenin built would be almost unrecognizable by 1940. Stalin's rise was not inevitable. It was the product of specific political miscalculations by his rivals, his own extraordinary skill at bureaucratic maneuvering, and a political culture that the Bolsheviks had themselves created, one that valued discipline over debate and treated opposition as betrayal. But that story, the story of what the Soviet Union became under Stalin, is a different chapter. What we are examining here is the birth, and the birth alone is extraordinary enough. Consider what had actually happened in the space of roughly 5 years, from 1917 to 1922. A 300-year-old dynasty had collapsed under the weight of a catastrophic war. It was never equipped to fight. A liberal provisional government had failed to bridge the gap between its own moderate program and the population's radical needs. A small, disciplined revolutionary party had seized power in a coup that most of the country barely noticed, then survived a civil war that killed, by various estimates, somewhere between 7 and 12 million people when you include combat deaths, famine, and the influenza pandemic that struck simultaneously. A new state had been constructed on ideological foundations that had never been tested at scale, in a country that was still overwhelmingly agrarian, still largely illiterate in parts, and still deeply religious despite the new government's militant atheism. The USSR was not born from a triumphant revolution. It was born from exhaustion, from the rubble of an empire, from a war that consumed an entire generation, and from the determination of a group of people who had decided, with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction, that they understood the direction of history and were willing to pay any price to prove it. That certainty would be both the source of the Soviet Union's extraordinary achievements and the seed of its most terrible crimes. The borders drawn in those years, often hastily, often for tactical political reasons, would define conflicts that are still unresolved today. The relationship between central authority and national identity that the Soviet founders tried to manage with their system of nominally autonomous republics would ultimately be one of the forces that brought the whole structure down in 1991. The tension between revolutionary idealism and the brutal pragmatism required to hold power in a hostile world would never be resolved. It would simply be suppressed until it could no longer be. And perhaps the deepest legacy of this founding moment is this. The Soviet Union proved that a state could be built on a deliberate ideological blueprint rather than on historical tradition, ethnic identity, or religious authority. It proved this could be done at enormous human cost, and that such a state could become a superpower. But it also proved over 70 years that a state built on the suppression of the contradictions within it will eventually be consumed by them. The collapse of 1917 created something new. The collapse of 1991 revealed what had always been there underneath. What do you think was the more decisive factor in the Bolsheviks' survival? Their organizational discipline and political ruthlessness, or the failures and divisions of everyone who opposed them? That question does not have a clean answer, and that is exactly what makes it worth thinking about. Leave your answer in the comments. Serious historical discussion happens down there, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. If this kind of history, honest, detailed, and without the myths, is what you are looking for, subscribe to the channel. We do not simplify to the point of distortion, and we do not dress up speculation as fact. In the next video, we are going inside the Soviet Union's first decade of rule, the purges that had not yet happened, the genuine social experiments that did, and the moment when the revolution began to devour the revolutionaries themselves. It is a story that is somehow even stranger than this one. But to understand why that next chapter would be so dark, we need to sit with the founding moment a little longer. Because there are details from these early years that rarely make it into the broad historical narrative, and they matter enormously for understanding everything that came after. One of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of the Soviet founding was the question of what to do with religion. Russia was not merely a Christian country in a nominal sense. The Orthodox Church was woven into the fabric of daily life for tens of millions of people. It blessed births and marriages and deaths. It organized the calendar. It gave peasants a framework for understanding suffering and hope. The Bolsheviks, committed Marxists who viewed religion as, in Lenin's phrase, the opium of the people, moved against the church almost immediately. Churches were confiscated. Priests were arrested. Religious education was banned. The church's enormous land holdings were seized. What makes this particularly striking is the timing. The Bolsheviks launched this campaign against the institution that most Russians trusted more than any government, while simultaneously asking those same Russians to trust a brand new government that had never existed before. The tension this created was real and immediate. In some regions, resistance to the closure of churches was more intense than resistance to grain requisitioning. The Bolsheviks suppressed it, but they never fully resolved it. The religious question would simmer beneath the surface of Soviet life for the entire 70 years of the state's existence, periodically erupting in ways the leadership found genuinely difficult to manage. There was also the question of women. And here the early Soviet record is genuinely complex in ways that resist simple characterization. The new government moved faster and further on women's legal equality than almost any state in the world at that moment. Divorce was made simple and accessible. Abortion was legalized in 1920, making Soviet Russia the first country in the world to do so at a national level. Women were granted full legal equality in property and inheritance. The Zhenotdel, a department of the Communist Party specifically dedicated to women's issues, was established and sent organizers into the most remote corners of the country, including deeply conservative Muslim regions of Central Asia, to advocate for women's rights. This was not without its own forms of coercion and cultural insensitivity, but it was also genuinely radical for its time, and it changed the lives of millions of women in ways that could not simply be reversed when the political winds shifted. These early social experiments tell us something important about the nature of the Soviet project in its founding years. The Bolsheviks were not merely seizing power for its own sake, or at least not only that. They genuinely believed they were building a new civilization. They believed that human nature itself could be reshaped by changing the material conditions of life. They had theories about art, about architecture, about how cities should be organized and how children should be educated. Soviet avant-garde art and design from the early 1920s remains influential to this day precisely because it was produced by people who thought they were inventing the visual language of a new world. Constructivism, the artistic movement that emerged from this period, was not decoration. It was a manifesto. This collision between utopian ambition and brutal political reality is the defining tension of the Soviet founding. The same government that was producing extraordinary experimental theater and revolutionary poster art was also operating the Cheka, the secret police force established by Felix Dzerzhinsky in December 1917, just weeks after the October Revolution. The Cheka's mandate was to protect the revolution from its enemies, and it interpreted that mandate broadly. The Red Terror of 1918, launched after an assassination attempt on Lenin, resulted in thousands of executions of people deemed class enemies, often without trial. The infrastructure of political repression was built into the Soviet state from its very first months, not added later by Stalin, but present at the creation. This is the uncomfortable truth that serious historians of the Soviet Union have wrestled with for decades. How much of what came later, the show trials, the Gulag, the mass deportations, was a betrayal of the original revolutionary vision, and how much was simply the logical extension of methods and structures that were there from the beginning? There is no consensus answer. But the question cannot be avoided by anyone who wants to understand the Soviet Union honestly. What can be said with confidence is this: the founders of the Soviet state made choices in those desperate early years, choices driven by genuine crisis, by ideological conviction, and by the will to survive at any cost that locked in certain trajectories. The single-party state was not inevitable from the moment of the October Revolution. There were moments when a coalition government was possible. There were moments when genuine Soviet democracy, power actually held by the elected councils rather than by the party apparatus above them, might have developed differently. Each time the Bolsheviks chose consolidation over inclusion, control over competition. Each choice made the next choice easier and the alternatives harder to imagine. By the time the USSR was formally proclaimed at the end of 1922, the range of possible futures had already narrowed dramatically. The state that existed was one where a single party held a monopoly on political power, where that party's internal discipline was enforced with lethal seriousness, where the secret police were a permanent feature of governance rather than an emergency measure, and where the gap between the official ideology of worker liberation and the actual experience of workers and peasants was already wide and growing. The men who signed the declaration creating the USSR in December 1922 believed, most of them genuinely, that they were writing the first chapter of a story that would end with the liberation of all humanity. They had survived things that should have destroyed them. They had built something from rubble that the entire world had expected to collapse. That survival bred a confidence, a certainty, that would prove to be one of the most dangerous qualities a governing class can possess. History rarely gives us clean villains or pure heroes. What it gives us, if we look carefully enough, is people making decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, driven by a mixture of conviction and fear and ambition, and then living or not living with the consequences. The birth of the Soviet Union is one of history's most dramatic illustrations of that truth. A collapsed empire, a world war, a revolution that almost failed, a civil war that consumed millions. And from all of that, something genuinely new, genuinely unprecedented, and genuinely terrible in ways both its founders and its enemies failed to fully anticipate. That is how the USSR was born. What do you think was the most consequential decision made in those founding years? Was it the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the creation of the Cheka, or something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments. These are the kinds of debates that historians still have, and your perspective matters. If you made it to the end of this video, subscribe to the channel. We cover history the way it deserves to be covered, with honesty about what we know, what we do not know, and why it still matters. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about. In the next video, we go inside the 1920s Soviet Union, the power struggle after Lenin's death, the extraordinary and terrifying rise of Stalin, and the moment the revolution turned on itself. You will not want to miss it.